Welcome to Module 2, Gender, Power, Organizations, and Leadership. In this module, we'll be considering some key concepts of power and leadership in educational organizations and examine how gender shapes those understandings in ways that may open or close opportunities for both women and men in educational bureaucracies. Before we do so, however, some announcements. First, the forum for this module, as well as Modules 3 and 4, will follow a different format than Module 1. In the instructions for the forum on eClass, you will find the last name of 4 authors listed, and beside each one will be the last names of students who will be responding specifically to that reading in the forum. So that means that you will skim the other 3 readings, but you will read your assigned reading carefully for key meanings and then provide a brief discussion of the main points and your own ahas or issues of particular interest to you on the forum. You'll follow that by a question to prompt discussion by your forum group colleagues. Second, you will notice in the syllabus that additional assignments begin next week, that is additional to the forum, begin next week in Module 3. If you haven't already done so, please have a good look at the assignment descriptions. And if you have any questions, let me know as soon as possible. You'll want to plan for the assignments ahead of time because they follow on one another quite quickly, actually, because this is a compressed course, with one assignment in each of Modules 3, 4, and 5. Module 5 is a bit longer in the number of days that it contains than the others, so that helps, but you'll need to be on top of the assignments. If you run into any problems, please let me know as soon as possible so that I can work with you to finish your assignments on time, if that's at all possible. And let's hope that that doesn't happen, but if it does, I'm certainly here for you to support you in that process. And that brings me to the last item. If you have any questions at all, you can email me and I will try to get back to you as soon as possible. And I usually do in pretty good time. If necessary, we can chat by email, Skype, or phone to discuss whatever your question is. So don't hesitate to get in touch. I'd rather you get in touch sooner rather than later. Okay, so let's look at some of the authors of the articles that we're going to be looking at in this module. I always like to know something about the authors I'm reading and thought you might too. Rebecca Coulter is a friend and colleague from my days at Western in Ontario, but long before that, Rebecca, who is a feminist historian, was exploring key questions in contemporary education through the lens of history. She is now retired and continues her historical work looking at the work of women in education, as well as supporting Indigenous scholarship. Chris Bruner is coordinator of the Education Policy and Leadership Program in the Department of Organizational Leadership Policy and Development at the University of Minnesota in the U.S. She has explored issues of power and gender in senior leadership, particularly the work of school system superintendents, where there hasn't been much work done actually, as part of her body of work, and it has been very influential in the EdAdmin scholarship. Marianne Coleman is an emeritus reader in educational leadership at the Institute of Education, an absolutely stellar institution where I've been lucky enough to attend some conferences. And that's in London, in England, and has a long and distinguished history of strong scholarship, particularly in the area of gender and social justice. She continues that important work after retiring as part of Nurture UK, which is an organization that's working to meet the challenge of child hunger. Kate Roumaniere is a historian in the Social Foundations section of the Department of Educational Leadership at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. She has primarily published in the area of the role of the principal and how it has changed over time. She also has done a significant amount of work with Aboriginal students looking at effects of cultural and language learning on their identity and retention at university. So let's look at some overarching themes in this module. Since the 1960s, women teachers across Canada and many parts of the world began to ask pointed and significant questions about how work was organized in educational organizations. Why are administrative positions predominantly held by men and teaching positions predominantly held by women? Why are men not better represented in elementary grades and women not better represented in certain subject areas at the secondary level? Their activism spawned discussion and political action that continues to this very day. The themes from this module begin to get at some of the reasons for these persistent questions. The 4 articles in this module demonstrate the ways in which gender stereotypes and organizational power intersect in a way that often disadvantages women who wish to seek formal positions of authority in schools and educational organizations. For example, Coleman and Bruner both look at the ways in which power is enacted. That is, what administrators do to get done what they believe is important to do in order to improve educational opportunities in their school. And how does that work for women in leadership when power is highly gendered? In fact, dominant forms of power, Bruner argues, are highly masculinized. That is, they are stereotypically masculine, even macho. So this helps us understand how gender stereotypes that inform preferred forms of power may exclude women or may affect what men and women are able to do, how they do it, and the satisfaction they gain from it in educational organizations, but in very complex ways. Both Coulter and Rosmaniere demonstrate how gender stereotypes and organizational power have overlapped with one another historically, and help us understand how these patterns of gendered expectations continue to inform gendered relations and forms of leadership in schooling today. The dean at the Faculty of Education at Western told me a story about being out with some students for a practicum in Edmonton, actually. He had been at the University of Alberta for several years before coming to Western. And as they walked down the hall behind 2 little boys, one leaned over to the other and whispered, in, that kind of whisper you can hear, "Who are all these big people?" And the other little boy whispered back, "The girls are going to be teachers and the boys are going to be principals." Already they had picked up on the fact that power and formal positions of authority are organized along gender lines in schools, and that many may expect to see a man in the principal's or superintendent's office. While things have improved in many ways since this story, statistics have been relatively steady. They tend to move up or down a little around a 70-30 split, with 70% of all teaching jobs being held by women and 30% by men, and about 70% of administrative jobs being held by men and 30% by women. These opposing numbers go up or down around 80-20 in some locations these days, and depending on where you are looking in the hierarchy of educational bureaucracies. For as Bruner says, the more power a position denotes, the less likely women are to hold it. This holds true in that the statistics are lower for women holding superintendent positions than they are for secondary principalships, and the stats are even higher for women principals at the elementary level, for example. So the higher the level of power that's perceived for that position, the less likely women are to hold those positions. So we can see that conceptions of power shape opportunities and practices of female administrators, and males for that matter. We certainly see this tendency in the historical record. For example, Coulter's look at Donalda Dickey, a remarkable, absolutely remarkable progressive educator, scholar, textbook author, and curriculum developer, particularly given the time period when she worked from the Second World War to the early 60s. Despite her highly respected work and impressive academic credentials, she was never offered or held a formal position of leadership, and she likely didn't expect to be formally recognized due to the gender norms of the day in which men led and women taught. But she did provide informal leadership and just got on with the work that needed to be done. She simply carved out a place for her gifts and was influential at all levels of education, including the Faculty of Education where she taught, boards and ministries of education, and in her discourse with a wide range of male influencers and administrators. Throughout her working life as an educator of note, she advocated for wider opportunities for girls and took on the misinformation in various texts about First Nations people. Her progressivist beliefs, informed by the highest level of education attained at various universities in Canada, the US, and the UK, were embedded in her work and the products of that work, influencing pedagogy and curriculum content for years. As Coulter notes about the intersection of gender and power in Dickey's life, Thus it was that Dickey exercised power. She claimed the right to be heard in the educational discourse and moved into spaces where action mattered and where getting things done made a difference. While it's almost impossible for us to understand how Dickey could have been ignored for a leadership position, just as many other women were ignored for decades, Coleman offers a theory based on her empirical research that offers some insight. According to Coleman, women have been, and to a somewhat lesser degree continue to be, unwelcome in school administration because they challenge what she calls the male orthodoxy of leadership simply by being there. That is, they challenge stereotypical male norms because, to use my example from my phrase from Module 1, leadership is congruent with the stereotypical masculinity box. Let's look at those characteristics and how they play out for women held within a feminine box of stereotypical expectations. So here we have the masculine norms, where men are expected, and the feminine norms, where men are expected to interact with one another and exert authority in the public sphere. It could be this public sphere of business, politics, social organizations like education, and so on. Whereas women are expected to exert influence in the private sphere, doing their domestic duties, taking care of children, making a way for the family to interact, and so on. Men, therefore, because of their interactions in the public sphere, are seen as natural leaders within that sphere, whereas women are seen as very unnatural leaders in that sphere because they are not expected to be there, they're expected to be here in the private sphere. Men are also perceived to lead others based on reason rather than emotion, which is what women are perceived to lead on. A masculine norm is one of activity, whereas a feminine norm is one of passivity. And so when we look at these characteristics of these two spheres, we can see where one maps more naturally onto conceptions of leadership, whereas the other does not. I have sometimes in face-to-face classes asked students to put the name of a leader that they immediately think of when they think of the word leader or leadership on a sticky note, and we put them up on a blackboard or a whiteboard, and then we look for patterns. And one of the main patterns that pops out almost immediately is that almost all of the suggestions are male. And now that's because males are overrepresented in the sphere of leadership, but also because the characteristics that they represent are seen as more naturally present in the sphere of enacting leadership. And this, of course, has implications for women. And some of those implications for women who enter that sphere are experiencing sexism, where their voice may be ignored at meetings, where they're isolated because they're one of maybe only them or one of two or three other women in a large group of men. And so it's easier for them to be ignored by that larger group. If it were reversed, it would probably be the same. They need to justify their position. Why are you here? And why aren't you occupying the position that you're expected to hold? So they have to justify the fact that they have left home, hearth, children, and are now occupying this public domain. And some do that. For example, one woman that I interviewed never put pictures of her family up in her office because it was a reminder to those who came into her office that she may not be able to justify being in that position. So these kinds of things are kind of poignant, but nevertheless, they are the kinds of things that happen. Conversely, some reported that they were able to use gender stereotypes to their advantage at times. In reinforcing that norm, they were able to get people to do what they wanted them to do. I have some issues with that, but nevertheless, it's what worked in that situation, and so they used it to their advantage rather than disadvantage. Work-life balance, of course, is the largest, and that is where relationships become complications because of the work that's attached to that for women, less so for men. Of course, depending on circumstances, but that tends to be the tendency. And so many women who take up these positions are single, divorced, their family is grown, or if they are younger women, they're considering very carefully whether they're going to have children or not. And I've heard that many times from women in courses that I've taught or women that I've interviewed. Again, this demonstrates the complexity of moving outside of the sphere that you're expected to occupy and move into one that you are not expected to occupy, and what that means in the lived experience of women who do take up positions of leadership. Her conclusion, however, that is Coleman's conclusion, is that while gendered orthodoxies of leadership are harmful to women in many ways, they may be harmful to men too, particularly unconventional men, as well as who are in, other men who are in positions of leadership and wish not to lead in the ways that the orthodoxy suggests. Bruner reinforces much of what Coleman says and begins by providing a really good discussion about the social construction of gender, which is a great review of our discussion in Module 1 if you want to have a look at that. Having done that, she then considers how power is conceptualized, and like Coleman, draws attention to the ways in which constructions of gender overlap with conceptions of power. As many feminist theorists have argued, binary notions of gender, that is, gender stereotypes, are very influential in the social construction of who can do what and how they are expected to do it. As Bruner writes, modern conceptions of power align in large part with particular constructions of gender, and social norms that expect a congruence of power and gender have strong potential to limit access for some groups of people to roles that have been masculinized, specifically the position of superintendent of schools, which is what she looks at in her article, kind of the pinnacle of power relationships in educational organizations. Bruner then looks at how power has been conceptualized by theorists over time, and she notes that these theories of power fall into two major categories: power over and power with. Power over has been the most predominant way in which power has been understood and enacted, which fits with stereotypical notions of masculinity. So we have coercive power, remunerative power, normative power, rewards power, and so on. All of these theories of power imply that one person has more of something than others. So that leads to power over, which is gendered as masculine, but it is not a conception, as she finds in her research, that every male perceived as powerful holds. While power with is often put forward as a preferred model of leadership in schools and school systems, for example, shared leadership, servant leadership, collaborative decision-making, site-based management, and so on, gender orthodoxy is still a powerful indicator of who does what and how in educational organizations. But the actual picture is highly complex. So when we look at these models of power with that she examines, she indicates that this is, we could call this getting things done with others rather than getting things done by others. So in this model then, power then is a capacity that a community of people attains when their acts of communication, cooperation, and collaboration have been successful. All school leaders in formal roles of leadership work both inside and outside the boundaries of the gendered power model that is expected of them. The difficulty is, as both Coleman and Bruner demonstrate, when those boundaries are challenged, the response can be challenging. For example, as you listen to the voices of both the male and female superintendents she interviewed and reports on in her paper, you hear them struggle with those boundaries around issues of power and getting the job done. As she finds, not every man preferred power over, and not every woman enacted power with. Both men and women used mixed conceptions of power, although there was a tendency toward this by males and a tendency toward this by females. And lastly, we're going to look at Rosemeyer, who examines the complexity through an historical and arts lens by first examining the history of the principalship and then to how it has been portrayed through film over time. It's a really interesting examination. Surprisingly, just like in Canada, the stats we have been discussing were very different. Prior to the 1950s, 2/3 of what we might have called the principal's position, although it wasn't generally at the time, were held by women who taught and managed teacherages in small 1- and 2-room schools that dotted the North American landscape in the early part of the 20th century. However, with the consolidation of schools in the 1950s and the 60s, school organizations became larger, more bureaucratic and hierarchical, and the principal's role became one of management at the mid-management level of the organization. With these changes, conceptions of power and control that were believed necessary in larger schools within even larger school systems began to move to a more orthodox gendered model of power. The numbers of women in principalships as a result plummeted. All of these new principals occupied positions in larger schools that were built less on relationship within the community and became transformed into one of formal legitimacy. So legitimacy needed to be established where relationship had once sufficed. To do that, credentialing was increased, but participants were chosen by mostly male principals. Courses were organized in a way that did not provide for women's responsibilities in the home that remained at that time mostly unchanged, and women were frankly unwelcome in this predominantly male environment. Jean Hewitt, whom I interviewed for a large research project and also contributed a chapter to the book I referenced in the first module by Don Wallin and I, told the story of, soliciting being accepted into the principal's course, and she did that for 13 years. Now, it was held once a year, so for over 13 years, she tried to get some male principal, to offer her name as a reference for the course so that she could get into the course. And she was not successful during all of that time. As it turned out, after she got into the principal's program, her skills were recognized immediately, and she was placed in an assistant principal's and then a principal's position, then an assistant superintendent's position, and then she eventually became a senior administrator in the Ministry of Education in Ontario. So we can see how squelching these ambitions had effects on school systems. The other way in which legitimacy was established, in addition to credentialing, was promoting strong heterosexual masculine image for principals. Because of the association of that role with power and control, this became important. So, for example, returning veterans, particularly veteran officers after the war, were placed in these positions. And Jean tells the story of one of her principals who was a returning officer who used to strap kids and send it out over the PA system in the school so that everybody could quake in their boots, and he could maintain power and control through exertion of his physical strength. And of course, that also speaks to the preference for athletic coaches as well. And so there's some theorizing around why that might be the case, and still is the case in many ways. But most interesting, I think, in this paper is when she looks at the picture that emerges in the movies of the principal. It's a highly complex picture that emerges, but it's one that reinforces this image of the strong male leader, either one who is a bumbler, who is emasculated by the bureaucratic demands of his job, and the students, as a result, run amok in the school, or a weak male who can't control students, that is, a weak male who can't control students or bureaucratic demands. Conversely, we have the strong, somewhat violent even, principal who demands order and is able to establish control of students and assert authority within an unreasonable bureaucracy. She notes as well that another picture emerges, mostly female, of the corrupt principal, whose values destroy order in the school. Clearly, only one orthodoxy is preferred if the goal is power and control, and that is of the kind of hypermasculine or macho version that Bruner and Coleman discuss. So what does all of this mean for women who are now or wish to pursue leadership positions in schools? Well, it means that persistence and support is vital, and that it is not only possible but necessary for women to occupy these positions so that their professional gifts, like Donalda Dickey's, can enrich schools and the communities they serve. It may mean there will be resistance when they get there, but it also means that as their numbers increase to be more representative of their actual numbers overall, many of the challenges they face will be made easier. We're seeing that to some degree in many public spheres. Politics, for example, in the States for the presidential election, we're seeing more women enter that race. It's often 3 steps forward and then 1 or 2 steps back, but it's progress, and we can all celebrate that. So I hope this video will paint the broad strokes of these interesting papers for you, and I'm looking forward to your discussions about them in your forums. If you have any questions at all, please let me know.